Have you ever wondered why medieval soldiers fought in tight, shoulder-to-shoulder lines? It seems risky, maybe even outdated, especially when arrows are flying and swords are swinging. But there's a reason behind it, and it's not what most people think. These formations weren't just about tradition or discipline. They were part of a smart, highly functional system built to survive the chaos of battle. In this video, we're diving deep into the real logic behind medieval battle lines. From how sound signals controlled entire armies, to how injuries on ancient skeletons reveal the moment a formation collapsed, we're breaking down the forgotten mechanics of war. This isn't about flashy sword fights. It's about order, strategy, and the small details that kept entire armies alive. Number 1. Battlefield imprints in bones and soil. In 1361, the island of Gotland witnessed a brutal clash near the town of Visby, where a force of local defenders met a professional Danish army. Centuries later, when archaeologists began excavating the mass graves left behind, they uncovered a grim but fascinating snapshot of medieval warfare in action. Over 1,100 skeletons were recovered, and among them, researchers noticed a clear pattern. The vast majority of combat injuries were focused on the legs. More than 450 showed sharp force trauma like deep slashes or chopping wounds, mostly below the knees. Strikingly few injuries were found on the torso or head, which raised important questions about how these men had fought and died. The injuries weren't random. Almost all the cuts to the legs were angled upward, indicating that attackers had deliberately aimed under something. That something was the medieval shield wall. These men had stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping, protecting their bodies from roughly the knees upward. The attackers, knowing this, didn't try to hack through the shields. Instead, they targeted the one area left vulnerable, beneath the defensive wall, cutting up into the legs through narrow gaps. This points to a high level of tactical awareness. The enemy clearly understood the mechanics of the shield formation, how high the bottom edge of the shields would sit, and exactly where a blade could land with deadly precision. These weren't wild, chaotic swings, they were targeted strikes, aiming for weak points based on real combat experience. Even the layout of the mass grave confirmed how organized the defenders had been. Archaeologists found that the bodies were spaced in ways that matched the positions soldiers would have held in formation, roughly 0.9 meters apart. That's the same spacing found in post holes nearby, likely from wooden stakes or field defenses. It also matches the functional elbow room needed in a shield wall, close enough for protection but wide enough to maneuver a spear or axe without bumping your neighbor. In essence, the bones and the earth still remember the line. The way these soldiers died, how their wounds were placed, how their bodies were buried, mirrors the structure they stood in when they fought. It's one of the clearest examples we have of archaeological evidence aligning directly with battlefield tactics. Number 2. Sound as a combat signal. In medieval battles where vision was often blocked by dust, smoke, or even tightly packed formations, sound became one of the most reliable tools for battlefield coordination. Drums, horns, and shouted calls weren't just background noise, they were structured, intentional signals that helped keep formations together and allowed commanders to issue orders across chaotic distances. Interestingly, even though medieval European chronicles rarely detailed how sound was used in combat, parallels can be drawn from Chinese military texts of the Han Dynasty. There, drums controlled the rhythm of movement in large infantry formations. As long as the beat stayed above the level of battlefield noise, it could organize units across 100 to 120 meters, basically the size of a standard medieval battlefront in Europe. The concept was that tempo could be felt as well as heard. Soldiers didn't need to think, they just moved with the beat. This principle of audible command wasn't exclusive to China. In Celtic warfare, the carnix, a tall bronze horn often shaped like an animal head, was used to produce a shrill, high-pitched sound. Its frequency, around 500 hertz, was chosen for a reason. It could pierce through the clash of swords, armored movement, and yelling men. These horn calls cut through the battlefield environment in a way human voices couldn't. The same basic logic applied to Norse war horns and even early Islamic battle trumpets. In Europe, especially by the late Middle Ages, drums and horns became standardized. A single drum beat could mean advance. 2 quick beats might signal brace. A long roll could mean prepare to charge. These codes varied between armies but followed the same idea: rhythm as instruction. Some drummers were even trained to adjust their tempo depending on the unit's position or morale. Faster beats could lift energy and speed, while slower rhythms helped maintain defensive formation. This use of sound also had a psychological layer. Marching to a steady beat gave soldiers a sense of unity and rhythm, which reduced panic and helped keep formations tight. It also helped soldiers conserve energy. They weren't guessing or overexerting. Their minds and bodies were synced to a shared auditory signal. Number 3. Colors as visual commands. Long before the introduction of standardized military uniforms, medieval armies relied heavily on color as a method of organization and battlefield communication. In the smoke and confusion of battle, recognizing friend from foe or simply knowing where your unit was could mean the difference between holding formation or falling apart. Color solved 2 key problems: visibility across the battlefield and clarity in issuing commands. By the mid-12th century, the development of heraldry became not just a way to display noble lineage, but a functional military tool. Heraldic rules began to restrict the use of certain color combinations. For instance, pairing 2 dark or 2 light colors, like black and purple or white and yellow, was discouraged or even outright forbidden. The goal wasn't aesthetics, it was visibility. If a coat of arms or a banner couldn't be clearly distinguished from 80 to 100 meters away, the average viewing distance in a battlefield context, its purpose was lost. In combat, that distance was about the width of a formation or the space between 2 companies of troops. Visual clarity had to be instantaneous. Commanders used these heraldic colors as signals. Shields, tabards, flags, and lances were all painted with distinctive designs so that soldiers could locate their unit leader quickly. It wasn't uncommon for each unit or group of archers to carry color-coded identifiers. During the 100 Years' War, archers in the English army under Henry V reportedly placed upright poles in front of their positions, each wrapped in cloth from the commanding officer's mantle. These color posts acted as visual anchors. If a banner was lost in the chaos, the pole still marked unit boundaries and helped troops maintain cohesion. In larger armies, multiple colors were used to differentiate divisions or battles, what we'd now call battalions. Colors were applied not only to banners, but also to trumpet banners, horse caparisons, and even shield borders. Each color combination told a soldier something. This is my group. This is where I stand. This is the person I follow. Color also carried symbolic weight. Red might imply aggression or a leading role in attack. Blue could suggest loyalty or defense. While not universally codified, many armies used these cues consistently enough that they became recognizable over time. Even in retreat or confusion, these visual markers allowed soldiers to regroup. A man lost in the chaos could scan the field, find his unit's colors, and rejoin them. That made color not just a passive display, but an active battlefield tool, quick to read and hard to fake. Number 4, the economics behind the line. In medieval England, the strength of an army wasn't just about knights or nobles. It was deeply tied to law, economics, and the everyday man. The idea of placing thousands of commoners in organized shield lines wasn't a random choice. It was a direct result of national policies that turned regular people into soldiers, and economics made this system efficient, scalable, and surprisingly effective. It all started with the Assize of Arms in 1181. This royal decree, issued by King Henry II, legally obligated every free man in the kingdom to possess weapons and armor according to his wealth. It wasn't just a suggestion. There were official inspections to make sure men actually owned and maintained their gear. Wealthier citizens had to provide more complete armor and a sword, while poorer men were required to have at least a spear and a shield. This law turned military readiness into a civic duty and ensured that the crown could quickly raise a large fighting force without funding a professional standing army. What made this system smart was how it leveled the battlefield. Literally. Thousands of rural men were suddenly outfitted in nearly identical gear. This uniformity made it much easier to train them to fight in lines. Teaching complex cavalry maneuvers required years of experience and expensive horses. But forming a basic shield wall? That could be taught quickly and effectively, especially when everyone already had similar weapons. This created an early version of mass infantry, long before professional armies were common. The policy didn't stop there. A century later, the Statute of Winchester in 1285 expanded these obligations even further. It included apprentices, laborers, and even the urban poor. Every fifth adult male was legally required to own at least a bow or a crossbow. This dramatically increased the number of trained missile troops available to English commanders, giving rise to the famous English longbowmen that would dominate later medieval warfare. Again, this wasn't about elite soldiers. It was about the system, a kind of grassroots militarization built on economic practicality. By spreading the responsibility across the entire male population, England created an enormous pool of reserve soldiers. When war came, commanders didn't need to search for specialists or rely solely on mercenaries. They could simply call on towns and villages, knowing most men were already armed and familiar with formation-based fighting. This also gave them incredible flexibility. A line of spearmen could hold ground, a row of archers could harass from range, and it all came from law-backed logistics and economic foresight. Number 5. Swiss combat math. The Swiss Gewehrshaupten was not just a formation, it was a compact war machine built for maximum efficiency in both space and force. This block, typically made up of 100 infantrymen arranged in a 10 by 10 square, only took up about 9 meters by 9 meters of terrain. At a glance, it looked like a dense line or small group of troops, but inside it functioned like a human press. It wasn't about maneuverability, it was about raw power and cohesion. The logic was brutally simple. Instead of spreading troops across a wide front, the Swiss concentrated them into tight, organized units that could absorb cavalry charges and push back with sheer human weight. When enemy horsemen crashed into the front, the rear ranks didn't just stand there, they physically drove the front men forward. This created a continuous pressure effect that helped resist the momentum of horses and maintain the structure of the formation. It was like reinforcing a wall from behind, each man becoming a supporting beam for the one ahead. One of the most interesting elements was how the Swiss used sound to maintain internal coordination. Each corner of the square had drummers who played in synchronized patterns. The beats controlled not just marching, but pressure distribution. If the rhythm on one side faltered, especially on the right flank, it was a clear signal. Something was wrong. The formation would adjust accordingly, either by reinforcing that side or subtly shifting its orientation without ever breaking the front-facing line. The troops didn't need visual signals, they moved with the beat, responding almost instinctively. This formation wasn't created by chance. It emerged out of necessity during the 14th and 15th centuries, as Swiss infantry began facing better armed cavalry and foreign mercenaries. Traditional lines lacked the depth to survive cavalry impact, and looser formations fell apart too easily. The Gewehrshaupten solved both problems. It offered protection through density, allowed for internal communication through rhythm, and could shift its weight to respond to threats in real time. What made it even more effective was its psychological impact. To an enemy, charging at what looked like a solid cube of spears, with no visible gaps and a drum beat echoing from inside, was terrifying. The formation didn't retreat. It didn't flinch. And once the enemy's momentum broke, the block advanced slowly but relentlessly, like a battering ram made of bodies and steel. Number 6, stretching the front with illusion. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce used more than just manpower to win. He used perception. Outnumbered and facing the superior cavalry of the English army, Bruce and his commanders needed every advantage they could get. So they turned to tactics that played with the enemy's expectations. One of the most clever moves was how they made their front line appear far wider than it actually was. Bruce's infantry, primarily made up of spearmen arranged in tight, disciplined formations called schiltrons, were hidden in the woods at the edge of the battlefield. These schiltrons were like human porcupines, dense groups of men bristling with long spears, trained to withstand cavalry charges. But rather than deploying them all at once in a single block, Bruce had them emerge in staggered lines, one at a time, spaced out deliberately. To the English commanders watching from across the field, it looked like an endless line of Scottish troops pouring out of the forest. This illusion made the Scottish front appear twice as long as it really was. English scouts likely reported a larger force than was actually present. The visual trick created a psychological dilemma. The English now believed they were outflanked or at least evenly matched in numbers. And so they responded accordingly by attempting to move their cavalry around what they thought were exposed Scottish flanks. But there was nothing exposed. There were no ends to circle around. When the English cavalry repositioned for the flank, Bruce gave the order. The separated schiltrons collapsed inward, transforming from what looked like a loose, extended line into a single dense wedge formation. This spearhead charged forward as one, catching the English mid-maneuver. The illusion had worked. What the English thought was a vulnerable extended front became a compact, disciplined assault unit. Their cavalry, caught off guard and out of formation, couldn't react in time. The attack smashed into their center. This wasn't just clever battlefield theater, it was the use of terrain, spacing, and visibility to rewrite the rules of engagement. The Scots didn't need more men. They needed the enemy to believe they had more men, and they used every trick available. Tree cover to hide troop movement, staggered exits to fake numbers, and disciplined formations that could shift shape in moments. It's a classic example of how medieval commanders could manipulate not only the physical battlefield, but the mental one as well. In a world without drones or radar, sight was everything. If you could change what the enemy saw or thought they saw, you could change the outcome. At Bannockburn, that illusion turned a defensive line into a decisive strike, and misjudgment into English defeat. Number 7. Wounds tell tactical stories. When archaeologists examine medieval mass graves, they're not just counting bones. They're reading the final moments of a battlefield. Across major sites like Visby, 1361, Towton, 1461, and Al-Jubarota, 1385, researchers have found a surprising consistency. Around 60 to 70% of injuries are concentrated on the legs and heads. That pattern isn't random. It tells a very specific story about how soldiers fought, how formations worked, and what happened when things went wrong. In tight line formations, soldiers didn't face the enemy square on. They angled their bodies slightly inward, shoulders turned toward the center of the formation, and held their shields in unison, overlapping with the shields of the men beside them. This shield wall setup created a sort of continuous barrier, protecting the chest and abdomen of each fighter. When this formation held, it was incredibly hard for an enemy to land a clean blow to the torso. But the legs? Those were often exposed beneath the lower edge of the shield, and that's where most of the injuries come in. At Visby, over 450 of the skeletons had deep cuts to the legs, many of them made with heavy swords or axes, striking upward from below the shield line. These wounds weren't chaotic, they were precise. They show that attackers knew exactly where the vulnerable spots were. Striking low wasn't a sign of desperation, it was smart fighting against a shielded opponent. Head injuries also tell a tale. A high number of cranial fractures often indicates a different phase of the battle, usually when the line had already broken. Once formations collapsed, shields lowered, and soldiers were either running, stumbling, or already on the ground. That's when enemies could strike from above, landing fatal blows to the skull. So when archaeologists see a lot of skull trauma, They're likely looking at the aftermath of a rout, when the structured defense gave way to scattered retreat or close-quarter chaos. Interestingly, chest wounds are often absent or minimal in many of these mass graves. That absence is meaningful. It supports the idea that during most of the fight, soldiers' torsos were safely covered by the shield wall. Only when formations broke down did chest injuries begin to appear, if at all. Even blunt force trauma tells a story. Fractured forearms and jawbone suggest the use of maces or clubs, which were especially common when armored knights clashed at close range. These kinds of wounds often appear when formations were tight, but the weapons used didn't rely on slicing, just smashing through.